So let me welcome all of you to Chat with Matt. This is a little program I've created over the last 6 months. I don't do many of these. I try to find people who have something to say. And fortunately, today we have with us Jeff Constable from Korn Ferry. He and I have had a previous conversation, and I can assure you he has lots to tell you. So we're going to have a great conversation, and I think you're going to enjoy it. Again, the chat box is where you should put your questions. Keith Friedman, who I don't know if he's joined us yet, but he sent me a question, and we're going to make sure we cover that. But if any of you have questions, please use the chat box. Moderating or assisting me today is my wife, Peggy, the master of Zoom, and she will be watching the chat box, letting people into the room. And but with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Jeff Constable, just to tell you that he's with Korn Ferry. Over the years that I've been introduced at meetings, I found everybody always butchers my introductions. So I like my guests to use, in their own words, introduce themselves to us. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the spotlight over to Jeff Constable.
Great. Hi,
Jeff,
everybody.
Welcome to Chat with Matt.
Thank you, Matt. And thanks, Peggy. It's great to be here with you. And sorry for the people on the phone if I look like I have a little bit of a sunburn. Peggy was helping me with my lighting, but we couldn't get it quite right. I have not been out in the sun, but it's great to be here. And I see a lot of familiar names and faces when I scroll through the people online. I'm Jeff Constable. I am the global co-leader of the CFO practice at Korn Ferry. I'm fairly recently in that role. I just joined Korn Ferry a couple of months ago, but I've been in the talent and recruiting and leadership advisory business for coming up on 20 years now. So it's been a while. I live outside of Philadelphia, so I'm coming at you here from my house outside of Philadelphia, where I live with my wife and my 3 kids who are 21, 18, and 16, and our dog. And like I said, it's great to be with you, Matt. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Our organization, as you know, has been around. I've been running it for 25 years, and we've had over the years a great relationship with Korn Ferry. Are you allowed to mention the name of your previous firm?
Yes, I was with Spencer Stuart for almost 18 years. So I worked at Korn Ferry in 2001 and 2002. That was my entry into the search business. I left to go to Spencer Stuart in January of 2003, spent almost 18 years there, and then 2 months ago, boomeranged back to Korn Ferry.
Well, you get the Welcome Home Cotter Award, I guess. Is that what it is? Welcome back, Cotter?
Yeah, exactly.
For those of you who are old enough to remember that show. So the search business has gone through a lot of very dramatic changes over the years. Perhaps we can talk for just a minute about LinkedIn and how that's affected everything, and then we'll segue into the contingency retained issue.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it is really interesting. 20 years ago, I think the search business was, there were a few big firms and a lot of small ones. That part hasn't changed too much. People sometimes refer to the big 5 firms as the Shrek firms. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, but it's Spencer Stuart, Heidrick and Struggles, Russell Reynolds, Egon Zehnder, Korn Ferry, Shrek acronym, which seems a little cheesy to me, but there's still only 2 out of those 5 that are public, Korn Ferry and Heidrick. The others are private partnerships. I'd say the biggest change is that all of those firms and a lot of the business has transitioned from being, really pure play recruitment firms to really broad services businesses that help client organizations across the entirety of the talent and leadership landscape. So they're not just about talent you don't have, but they're also now about talent that you do have and how to sort of actualize that talent more effectively. I'll be really brief, but to your question about LinkedIn specifically, LinkedIn has become a great partner to the talent and leadership business. It certainly has commoditized sort of the finding of people. It used to be that all of the firms had their own proprietary databases. We have ours at Korn Ferry. Spencer Stuart has theirs. That hasn't changed too much, but now those databases are kind of linked into LinkedIn, if you will. And
Oh,
I'd say what used to be the core value proposition of the search business was the finding, right? Go find me somebody I couldn't find on my own.
right.
Now the finding is kind of
Kind
commoditized,
of,
not just
kind of
because of
hence the
LinkedIn.
name, Jeff, right?
Yeah,
The
that's right.
search business, but that's not really what you do, right? I mean, finding people is one aspect of it, and the contingency firms today are almost all using LinkedIn. They don't maintain proprietary databases, to my knowledge.
I think that's right. The barriers to entry to the search business have always been pretty low. They've probably gotten lower because of LinkedIn, right? You can just use that as your tool.
Yeah,
And so the finding's just a piece of it now.
yeah, and every human resource director has their LinkedIn account, and they've managed to put a lot of the low-level contingency firms out of business because they don't, for the bread and butter stuff, they don't use them anymore. And I think that's a good segue. I think the truth is on the finding part, a retained search firm like Korn Ferry, they only get the tough searches. If it was easy, they'd just ask around to a few friends. Maybe you'd want to educate us a bit on that.
Sure. No, it's a good point about the tough searches. We joke about that sometimes. Yeah, there's really some of it has to do with the business model of the search firm, right? There's some really great boutique search firms out there, many,
Mhm.
and they might have more flexibility on their revenue models and how they go to market. And a lot of their value propositions might be very much around the finding.
Right.
And to a candidate, they might feel a little bit like they're more behaving as your agent. Whereas on the retained search side, I think why do companies choose to use a retained search? A lot of times it might be measuring external talent to internal talent and taking a one size approach to that entire talent base. Give us
Oh,
the external scan, but compare the external world to the people we have internally. And the projects become much less about finding ideas and much more about assessing the talent to determine sort of who's great and who's good.
so that's really a very important point that a lot of firms, larger firms in particular, will use a retained search firm because they're not only looking, they're considering going outside, but they also want you to assess the in-house talent.
That's right.
A contingency firm is not going to do that.
No, typically not. And really the way the search business has evolved in some of these larger firms is that search work often grows out of consulting work. So it could be that the entry point for a Korn Ferry into a large enterprise client is to do a lot of coaching and development work at the top team, working with the CEO and his or her direct reports.
Mhm.
And from that work, it might be realized that there's two or three roles that are sort of needed at the senior. So the search work sort of trails some of the advisory work versus being a lead into it as it used to be.
Interesting. So, a contingency recruiter is only going to get called in once the firm has decided they need somebody.
That's right. That's exactly right. Once there's an active search, and like I said, we compete against. They're not always contingency, but we compete against boutique search firms all the time. Many of them are fabulous, and the fact is, if there's a real live active search need, I always tell this to all of my client companies. You owe it to yourself to find the people that have the deepest relationships already in that candidate market on day one. Like that's, you shouldn't have to sort of use a recruiter who's sort of learning their way around the people and the relationships at that time, because there's plenty of recruiters out there who know their way around different spaces.
Sure. Another aspect that I've observed over the years is that for some of the really big searches, like the CFO for Citibank, for example, everyone actually knows who all the candidates are.
Yeah, they're
But
all
no one can get to them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was just on a call. It wasn't a Citigroup level call, but
Mhm.
interesting, quick anecdote situation. It's a 10 or so billion-dollar market cap company that would be a pretty brand name known company where there's a fairly new CEO. And there's another search firm that's been working on the CFO search. It's been a vacancy that's been open for a little while.
Mhm.
There's fatigue. The CEO is tired of working with that firm. They're disappointed with how it's gone. We were having a call with the CEO about whether we wanted to sort of take a fresh look at it. And they shared with us all of the list of the other search firm, and we looked at that and we sort of tried to determine, how would our list look, and are there holes that are missing? And it was really interesting because the answer there, I mean, there's a lot of data sources of those names, right? There's names coming from board members, there's names coming from the other search firm, there's names coming from executives on the team, there's names coming in from their accountants and their bankers. So you add all that up and there's hundreds of names, and it's a question of how much contact has there really been with that group, and if you really segment out those hundreds of people, has anybody really leveraged the relationships that they have with sort of the top 10 or 15 names on the list? And we ultimately decided that's an area where we probably could be successful if this company wants us to take it over, because the people that are maybe at the top of that list, between us, we are pretty close to.
Yeah, because if you can't talk to people, you can't encourage them to leave someplace where they might be very happy to go to some place where maybe they'll be happy, but then again, maybe they won't.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a sales job. And I think a lot of it requires this relationship that you develop with your client companies, perhaps from the consulting work, and perhaps also from your long-standing relationships with them and understanding who they are and what they do and how they do it.
I think that's right. And when you're in a functional role, like I am, working mostly with financial officer talent,
Yeah.
I work across industries and I work with a lot of different companies. The relationship on the candidate side matters a lot too. You have to sort of you build a trust relationship over a long time. I have placements in companies where the first time I met that individual might have been 10 or 12 years ago. And that individual might be trusting me that I've been paying attention to these conversations. And if they said one time that I'll never live north of the Mason-Dixon line, or I'll never work in the consumer business again, or something like that, then I have to know not to just blast a call to them, or not have one of my colleagues call them about, a Northeastern-based consumer business role, right? Because that life cycle, that history, that relationship really matters. And that's something that I love about the work. I've always loved it about the work, and it makes me bullish about the future of our work. We get to sort of use the strategic part of our brains to work with companies, right? And those are people in companies. You build the relationships with people in the companies, but you have to understand the strategic context of the company. But then on the other side, working with people and what we think of as candidates, that's dealing with people's lives and their individual motivations, right, and where they are in their lives.
I think it's very important that search people are concerned about the happiness of the candidates they're placing. Even if it's a god-awful situation, it might be the right one for them. And if you tell them that it's a god-awful situation and here are the landmines, they're accepting it, and hopefully they'll do well.
That's right. When I was early in this business, I think I personalized things too much, and I would sort of, form my own judgment about that role, or I'm not so sure I would want to work for that CEO. It doesn't really matter what I think. The answer is to sort of assess the situation. There is somebody who is going to fit perfectly with that CEO or that hiring executive, right, and who's really up for those challenges that situation poses. And when we're interviewing people, same way, like, when I interview people well, and I'm doing it well, it's not always every day that I do it well, but I need to kind of fade into the woodwork and not really be part of that conversation, but really draw out the best things in the candidate. And having made a move recently, I now have a totally new appreciation for, how much people's lives are being impacted and changed when they do make a change. It's a very big deal, especially if they move their families, and their entire life is reorienting to a new career situation. And I want to think that I have never taken that lightly, that's always been a really, something that I've held really dear in my work. But I do feel like I have new appreciation for it, having recently made a move myself.
Oh, well, there you go. That's why I thought you should start with that. That is a driving force for people who are in the search business. I have a lot of friends over the 25 years I've been doing this who are in the search business, and most of them are honestly like you. They care about the people they're placing, because this is one of the most important things you do every day, other than raising your family.
That's exactly right. I started out my career as a teacher, and I can feel myself as I get older sort of coming back to what really I think makes me tick. I went through this growth and development seminar about a year ago, and we had to come up with a purpose statement. And I've realized as I've gotten older, what really makes me tick is helping other people find sort of their growth and their purpose. And I hold that really. I don't know if I felt that every day in my early days in this business, you know, when you're sort of building a track record and all that stuff, and it felt more transactional, but
Sure.
I do feel it now. And now I have enough history and enough longevity and enough of a reputation behind me that there's a lot of people where I've really played a role, a small role, but a role in totally changing their lives. You know, they found the opportunity of their dreams, that they lived in the place they wanted to live or what have you. I've also played a role in some situations where somebody made a transition and it wasn't that great. And in some cases, I've kind of had to help them try to undo that and come up with a better option. But I think about that much more now than I used to when I was younger.
Yeah. So this is a good segue into the CFO role and how it's changed. I would tell you that in 1980, when I took over as chief financial officer of an advertising agency, the chairman of the company, who I knew quite well before I joined the firm, referred to my group as the bookkeeping department.
Yeah.
I think things have dramatically changed over the years.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk about your view of the CFO role and where it is right now?
Yeah, it's gotten really big, and it obviously varies a bit by company. But there's the way I think of it, and the way we sort of think of it at Korn Ferry is there's sort of 6 key dimensions to it.
Okay.
One is just sort of organizationally. You know, where does the CFO fit in the organization? It's still a very top, you know, it's a top level role, but it has really increasingly become kind of the number 2 executive in the company. So organizationally, it's sort of higher level and more critical than it's been ever before. Secondly, would be just the participation of the CFO in the strategy of the company. I think really good CFOs are real strategic sounding boards. They provide challenge and support, and they're a debate partner to their CEOs and to the leadership teams and to the board. So strategic sounding board would be sort of second area. Third would be, everybody uses, it's a little bit of an overused term, but the whole idea of being a business partner, CFO as business partner. And what we think of that meaning is the CFO really partnering with the people who run the business unit, or the head of sales, or the people that are driving the performance, and really helping them, sort of helping them in the form of monitoring performance, looking at variances versus budget, and helping be a partner to helping the business performance improve.
I found a lot of the people who actually make the business happen can come up with a lot of harebrained schemes, and as CFO, it's your job to take the hair out of them.
Yeah, that's right.
You would never, as a CFO, no offense to all my friends, but we're not high on the imagination scale. But when we're presented with a new strategy, a new product, we can dimension out all the costs and revenues.
That's exactly
how
right.
I see people partnering with the operating people.
Yeah, I think
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And I think that piece of it, that's probably been the biggest change, right, over the last 15 or 20 years, is this notion of CFO as business partner. And and the best business partners are, to your point, they're not necessarily filled with imagination, but they're wrapping context around some of the decisions that get made. And within that is a comfort level with being forward looking versus backward looking.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Go ahead. I think you had another point or two.
Yeah, a couple other points.
Didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry.
That's okay. No, the CFO is, I think, very much the steward of the financial and the regulatory health of the company. It used to be that was kind of like the role. Right now, it's a piece of the role. And then the final things I would say is, particularly in public companies, the CFOs are maybe not the voice, but a very powerful voice in the investor and capital markets community. In fact, we hear that a lot from boards and CEOs and from investors, that if they're disappointed in their CFO, and you ask and you kind of drill into why is that, it's usually that they feel like the CFO doesn't represent the lens of the investor enough. They want the CFO really have an investor point of view and bring that back to the leadership table.
Yeah. Okay.
And CEOs really are calling out for that. Then the final thing I would say, and this is maybe more, well, I was going to say it's larger companies, but it's really for any company. You know, the amount of change is crazy. 2020 has shown us, but every company has some kind of major transformation going on, large or small. So somebody with a comfort level in change, and that's really different about the CFOs of today. They have to have a really high tolerance around change and ambiguity, I think, more so than was the case, you know, a couple decades ago.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You know, we're going through, this is the most disrupting thing that's ever happened, COVID-19. As I say, as I've said many times, I don't know how they're going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but I know they're going to need a lot of CFOs to light the way. There's just so many pieces that have been put out of place, and someone's going to have to make sense of it from an economic standpoint.
Yeah, that's right.
And I like your point about this whole explaining the company to Wall Street. You know, the people in the company might have some really great ideas, but Wall Street is interested that they have great ideas, but they want some metrics wrapped around it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, and of course, there's the whole short-term, long-term thing too, right? There's some investors that are thinking really long-term, and there's some investors that are thinking really short-term. And you know, I think what CEOs are craving is a CFO partner that is representing that long-term shareholder view within the company.
Yeah. So why don't we move to the mind of the CFO? I know it'll probably put everybody to sleep, but we should see what we can do with this. What do you look for? You know, as you talk to someone who is going to be the CFO.
Yeah. Well, I definitely look across those same dimensions, right? The ones we just talked about. So you know, for me, I kind of boil it down to sort of four things when I'm assessing people. One is I think of the person from a leadership standpoint. So you know, are they comfortable in something that feels CEO-ish, right? They are leading a large organization. Even in small companies, the financial organization is a fairly large organization. So what's their comfort level with leadership? How do they lead? What are some examples of how they lead people? How do they lead through change? So I assess a lot on the leadership dimension. That's often the separator between, you know, sort of a good candidate and a great candidate. The second thing is I try to drill into somebody's technical skills. I don't think CFOs today have to be deeply technical across every single dimension, but they typically have to have some sort of technical spike, you know, whether that's M&A or FP&A or accounting or treasury. They probably came up some kind of route in the CFO role. So where's their technical orientation? Where does that reside? How much do they lean on it? Do they have a sense for where their strengths are? Do they understand how to complement themselves with people around that? Thirdly, I spend a lot of time looking at how they partner, you know, what their relationships are with people around them, and are they comfortable partnering? I have this image in my head of CFOs sometimes who, some companies are set up in a way that if you are CFO, everything will sort of naturally roll into you. You won't really have to push yourself out too much, right? It's a centralized company. But I work with a lot of companies where the job of the CFO is to really inject herself out to the business and get in front of customers and get in front of executives that are in different regions. And so this notion of how do you partner? Do you expect people to kind of come to you, or do you go to them, is a big one. And then the fourth dimension that I look at pretty hard is how somebody thinks about the investor thesis of the company. And you know, I think sometimes we think about the investment thesis only in the context of new private equity deals, but every company's got an investment thesis, right? So I try to see how somebody has been thinking about that. Have they given it some thought? Do they have kind of an investor mindset to some extent themselves? And but that's how, when I sort of assess CFOs, I look at those four areas. And not everybody's going to be really spiky across all four, right? Some people are going to really gravitate towards talent and leadership, and maybe a little bit less towards the investor side. And it depends a little bit on what the situation calls for. But I also just try to see, like, how I'm also looking for a sort of a consistency of story and a level of self-awareness when someone is explaining themselves, because ultimately I'm going to hear their story told from others who know them. I'm going to make my own determination, but we do a pretty thorough referencing process on everybody, and we get recommendations from board members and whatnot. And, I'm always looking for a lot of consistency between what I heard from the individual and what I heard from others about them to make sure that self-awareness is there.
I've heard about people getting these 360 reviews. So it's very important how people manage up, manage down, manage to the side. I think that's an important element. Does Korn Ferry do psychological testing?
We do. We have Korn Ferry went on like a buying binge of all of these different tools in the assessment space over the course of about 7 or 8 years, and we kind of rolled them all into this kind of industry best-in-class assessment tool that we can sort of scale up or scale down. We call it KF4D. It stands for 4 dimensions, and it gets at kind of how you do things and why you do them, what really drives you, and it's a fabulous. I guess to call it a tool would be maybe a little bit oversimplifying it, but it's a fabulous tool, and it rolls through our search work. So candidates in searches take the KF4D, and then they get a chance to sit with an industrial psychologist and sort of understand the feedback. Sometimes the KF4D output is the separator between sort of, this person's the top candidate and this other person's the runner-up, and it's based on the assessment.
So you rely heavily on that tool.
Yeah, it's a big part of what we do. I mean,
do you ever overrule the tool?
The tool is an input. I mean, I think that we view the best assessments are going to have a lot of inputs, right? And you need sort of, and I'm a big fan of assessments. So if I have a client who says, look, we want our candidates to go through, your Korn Ferry tool, and we also want them to do Hogan, and we want them to do Myers-Briggs, and we want to use all these inputs, I'm totally okay with that. I think the more data, the better. But assessments are kind of one leg of the stool of assessing people. I think the second leg is the interviewing and referencing process and the human interaction of all of that, and compiling all of that data and judgment from people who are sort of in the know about this person. And then I think what gets lost, I've mentioned references. I think you can't emphasize that enough. I think the referencing process is critical in this situation, to sort of take what the assessments say and take what the headhunter interview is saying, and or the behavioral interviewing, and then test all that stuff with people who have worked with that individual for a long time. That's really where the story can kind of get verified or not.
Yeah, I would think the tools are very helpful in pointing you in the right direction to probe more deeply in your conversations with the candidate.
They are. I mean, that's one thing that people always ask me, sort of like, what's your interview? Like, do you have a standard interview? And I really don't, because I mean, I have a range of things that I might ask in an interview, but I try to bring the context of what's the actual situation, right? What's the client situation we're working on? There's going to be some things that are really important. And then what's the relationship context that I or we at Korn Ferry already have with that individual?
Yeah.
I don't love interviews where and I think a lot of people probably on the line have gone through this, and I can't say that I'm not guilty of this, because I definitely am, but I don't love to just sort of ask the person to start at the beginning and tell their whole life story. If I can piece all that together from either past contact points that I've had with the person, or in many cases, I'm dealing with somebody that they've already engaged with Korn Ferry somewhere along the line. If I dig hard enough, I can sort of find all those interview notes and their life story and all that kind of stuff. So I usually go into an interview with like, these are the 3 or 4 things I really want to spend an hour drilling into. And I try to tell the candidate that, like, that's where I want to focus our time in this session.
Do you do the testing before you do the interviewing?
Usually after. It varies. Sometimes it's before.
Because it would seem to be a pretty good tool to give you direction.
Yeah,
where you need to probe.
I like to, the tool is especially good when you think of it in the client company context, so because we can arrange the KF40 to not be generic, but to be tailored to the situation of that company. and of that search. And so our typical process, we vary it, but is to interview the candidate. And then if they become, if they have a meeting with the client and it looks like they're going to be a serious candidate, they would go through the KF4D assessment, and we'd start to layer that in. And that might lead to maybe not a second interview, but future touch points. We might drill into some specific topics that come out of that, or the KF4D might inform some of the questions we ask in referencing.
So maybe you can discuss, spend a few minutes, I didn't put this on the list, but how you prepare your candidates for their interviews.
Yeah. There was a time in my career when I feel like I was not spending enough time doing that. And that was a real learning for me. I think I mentioned to you, Matt, at one point that when I was at Spencer Stewart, this is probably 10 years ago, we started to survey our candidates. We'd always surveyed clients. It's not just like it's not like you bought a car and I need all 10s kind of thing. It was a pretty deep survey of clients, but we weren't surveying candidates. And we started surveying candidates. It was pretty eye-opening because, in my opinion, the candidates that are most likely to fill out the survey either had a wildly positive experience with you or a wildly negative one. A lot of the people in between didn't fill out the surveys, and I spent a lot of time focusing on what the negative people said. And I realized that it made me better at putting myself in the shoes of the candidate. I realized how important that communication was and how important the preparation was. I spend more time on that stuff now, and I do a lot of prep calls on weekends because that's sort of the time when you can kind of both be sort of relaxed. It doesn't have to be a weekend, and a lot of times I run my calendar pretty aggressively. So a lot of times I have my assistants schedule these and then schedule a debrief call after the candidate has met the client. But I like to cover the personalities of the people they're going to meet if I know them. If I haven't met everybody, I can't help with that too much. Cover the culture of the company, and then I don't lead candidates, even if the client has told me like we're going to ask people these 4 things. I don't lead candidates on here's what to expect in the interview, here's what you're going to get asked. I don't think that's a great practice, and I think everybody has to have some ability to kind of think on their feet, but I do lead them a lot around the personality and the culture and sort of what drives sort of decision making at the company.
Yeah, no, those are all very important things that I have found that when I've talked to people about their interviewing, that they're oftentimes selling the wrong thing.
Yeah.
It's not. No, really, it's not well understood. You have gone through, before you introduce candidates to clients, you've gone through a tremendous vetting process. All the people who are going to be talking to the client can easily do the job. So it's more a relationship sell than a technical skills sell.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, it's, and even when you look at research around when somebody's not effective or successful in a job, why was that? The biggest answer that organizations fall back on is culture fit, right? They weren't a good culture fit. And it is usually not at all. Nobody ever says, well, they didn't have the qualifications for the job, or they just couldn't do it, or we hired them and they just weren't, they didn't have the right experience. So all the resume stuff and the experience is kind of table stakes. And what's really going to determine whether or not this relationship sort of flourishes is whether there's some connection between the individual and the culture. And I've had situations, and I think I've gotten better at this as I've gotten older. There are situations when I just have to kind of call off a candidacy and call it off to the candidate and say, I don't think this is a great fit for you. I think you tend to do great in positive growth situations. This is a, edgy kind of turnaround. Like, I don't know. I think you're convincing yourself you want this, and I don't think it's a great matchup. Like, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So, oh, absolutely. I think I mentioned John Lux to you, the author of Rites of Passage, and he wrote another book towards the end of his life called Insights for the Journey. And there's these classic books like The Road Less Traveled, where on the first page they explain everything to you, and you don't really need to read the rest of the book.
Right.
Like life is difficult. If you accept that, everything makes sense. In John's world, your first job, he has one little section, like 2 pages, and it says, your first job is to fit in. The original bump steer is we're bringing you in to shake things up. And they leave unsaid the part about as long as you don't upset anybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
the
think that's
successful
exactly
candidates fit in.
Yeah. I have this one client that I work with. It's a large financial services company, and they are very careful about telling people, we don't want you to get focused on your 90 or 100-day plan here.
Mhm.
The way you're going to make an impact here is to fit in and kind of look, listen, and learn. Like, we'll come to you after 100 days and kind of get your, what are the lessons? What are the things you've synthesized from the first 100 days?
Yeah.
But if you come in looking to like make a bunch of change in that amount of time, we don't think that's like that's not right for our culture. And as you can imagine, they're a fairly stable culture, this particular organization.
Mhm.
There's other situations where maybe things are really broken, or maybe there was a set of practices that had gone awry where things need to get shaken up on day one, but it's all contextual.
Yeah. Why don't we do a few minutes on the relationship between the CFO and the board of directors?
Yeah. Really, really big, area of my focus, and actually an area that, kind of drew me to Korn Ferry. I think that we have an opportunity to create a little bit more linkage between our CFO practice and the stuff that we do in the board space.
Mhm.
I think CFOs after the CEO are increasingly, they're very much on the hearts and minds of the board. It's not just the head of the audit committee or the members of the audit committee, it's the whole board.
Mhm.
And we do a lot of board referencing on CFOs before we place them in roles, and we look for that kind of board readiness. I mean, some of the statistics that you read, and which are good statistics. There's a lot of people stepping into the CFO role for the first time. There's a lot of step ups, who step into the role for the first time.
Right.
Key consideration in those people is how much board experience have they had? Have they gotten in front of the board? Because it's so critical. You just don't see people stepping into the CFO role anymore who have sort of never been in front of the board. If they're internally promoted, there's typically been a pretty systematic way of getting that person in front of the board and building those relationships. And building relationships with board members is like building any relationships. It's but when it's non-COVID, it's doing Zoom calls like this one-on-one. It's being available to them. It's doing dinners with them. It's
Mhm.
it's making presentations to them. So
it's probably, I'm sure since you're head of a CFO practice, these are not the social butterflies of the world.
No.
And they have to, I think you have to tell them that they need to be a little social.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. A lot of board members are not super social, sometimes either. They're not always that way, but you're right that CFOs have to really push themselves oftentimes to be like really a part of that community. Yep. And
they really do have to push themselves.
Yeah, it's really critical. There are oftentimes when you see somebody who sort of didn't work out in a role as the CFO, and part of the reason is the board just never got totally bought in, and usually that's the fault of the CFO not having worked hard enough to create those relationships. It's usually not the fault of the board.
Yeah, it's not enough to be just technically expert.
That's right.
You're always selling.
Yeah, that's right. It's it's very true. And I think boards, the other sort of theme there that's driving that, Matt, is that boards are being much more, as they should be, held much more accountable in the last 5 years, 6 years, about really knowing the talent in the company, because they're so charged around not just CEO succession, but succession all across the C-suite. So you've seen boards get much more proactive and front-footed about not just knowing the CEO, but knowing the direct reports. I mean, some of the most progressive boards out there are doing, kind of 2-level step downs, where you'll have board members once a year go shadow somebody who sits, 2-3 levels below the CEO for like a day. So boards have become much more focused on the talent agenda at the company, and the CFO plays a huge role in that.
So a couple minutes before we break for questions, perhaps you have some best practices on engaging with the recruiters at search firms. I assume stalking is out of the question.
I mean, I think the first thing is to really focus on people who know your space. Like it used to be that I totally get this. I think there's a lot of people out there that feel like dealing with recruiters can be a real black hole. I think that we in the recruiting space still have a bit of an issue around feedback and follow up, and sometimes we can be the culprits of a black hole. And I totally get that. And some of it is not bad intent. Some of it is just volume of activity of sort of what's hitting you at any given time. I think it's helpful when when a recruiter sort of gets right back to you that you are a candidate that sort of factors into their space. Like for me, when I get I get tons of emails from people. When I get an email that says I'm a great, chief marketing officer in pharmaceutical companies, I don't really have time to respond to that person. And chances are that person never took the time to read my bio. If they did, they would know that I'm never going to do a search for a CMO in a pharmaceutical company because our world has gotten pretty specialized. So I'm always a little surprised that I think people think that recruiters can be a bit lazy and sort of focus on what's right in front of us. I think sometimes candidates don't take the extra step to really research. I mean, every recruiter out there, their bios are on their websites, their contact information on their websites. You can see what they do, what they work on. Some even I don't list out client companies I've worked with, but many do. And so so that's the first thing I would say is do the research. Find out like who and I always say, like, think about three things. What's your geography? What's your function? And what's your primary industry? And if you find a recruiter that specializes or kind of focuses on, hits two of those three buckets for you, then chances are they'll show interest in you on a proactive basis. And then the other thing I would say is it's always really helpful to get introductions from other people. So I have I've been able to work on, over the course of now 20 years, I've placed hundreds of CFOs and senior finance people, and whenever one of my placements comes and makes a recommendation of somebody that's like worked for them, I spend a lot of time with those people. Or like a board member that I've worked with who says, "Hey, I'm rolling off this board, but their CFO is fabulous. I want to introduce you." So I work a lot through networks of people that where I already have a trust-based relationship, and I prioritize those ahead of the ones that are a little bit cold.
Right. I try to explain to my many friends that recruiters are only working on what they're working on.
Yeah.
And by and large, with staffing, no one has three secretaries anymore. If you're not working on if someone's resume comes through on an unsolicited basis, if it doesn't match anything you're working on, it's really hard to get back to them and explain why. There's a little misunderstanding. Obviously, most members understand that you're not working for them, you're working for your client, but still they get confused that you should know them anyway, just in case. You'll keep me in mind.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there was a stretch of time last year where I, in fairly good succession, placed CFOs in three relatively good sized banks, US based banks.
Oh, okay.
And I do a lot of work in that space, in banking and insurance and financial services. And so I'm pretty known in the banking space. And when there's a bank CFO that approaches me cold that I don't really already know, I do take that. Like if I'm prioritizing the emails that come to me that are cold, I'll take that one. And I often will say, like, often I've heard of the person or something, but I often will say, like, I'm surprised we didn't get to know each other on one of those three searches, right? Because I sort of felt like I touched every bank CFO in the country or something. So, focus on doing the research on finding somebody that really like lives in your space, and they probably will show more interest in you than you think. And if they don't, they just may not work in your space.
Right. That I think that's the key. You have to know what industries the recruiter is comfortable with, and if they've done recent searches in that space, they are people that you might want to connect with.
Yeah.
So we have a question. Since someone wrote into me, we're going to do our first question, and the question was it's from Keith Friedman, and it's about how has COVID changed the landscape? What are specific skills or attributes you think companies might be placing more emphasis on now with the COVID landscape?
Yeah,
it might not be anything you're working on at the moment, Jeff, just your gut.
Yeah, no, it's actually a great question. two things I would say about the COVID landscape. I might have cut out there for a second, but two things I would say. One is that from a search standpoint, searches are moving much quicker during COVID.
Okay.
So they are, because of Zoom, everything's happening by Zoom. Now the search business kind of went down in March, April, May, but it's come back pretty strongly. And the actual search process is able to move a lot faster. So that's one thing that's happening. But in terms of specific skills, which I think the question was, much more focus on liquidity, cost optimization, cost transparency. Now we're starting to see that shift more over to that business partnership side because companies are starting to think about growth again. But over the last 8 months, it's been all around liquidity, cost optimization, and cost transparency.
Yeah. All right, Peggy, you're on.
Okay. I've been taking good notes. All right. Do you think that the tools that you use lead to better matches? That was one of the questions.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about these tools and how you use them.
But people want to know, do you think that because you're using them that you're getting a better match, or do you think it's just another data point?
That's a really good question. I do think that I just think I don't know if I notice it, kind of quarter by quarter or week by week or even year by year, but when I think about kind of being in this business for 20 years, our matches are getting better and better. And it's not just because the algorithms and the tools are more sophisticated. I think it's we headhunters have become more advisory and consultative in how to deal with organizations. And I think we've realized that the value oftentimes in the relationship comes post-placement, right? Like the transition's just a moment in time for people, and we can't just kind of go away at that moment. And when we're in some of these large firms like Korn Ferry, we might have a customer lifetime value of that client organization that goes way beyond that placement. That placement's just a piece of the overall pie. So
it's very important that the candidates survive.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that stickiness is.
I have this friend, George Bratton. He does onboarding.
Yeah.
When he first told me about it, I didn't know what he was talking about, but he said, I don't know, something like 80% of the people are gone within 18 months.
Yeah, there used to be. I think the stickiness is kind of increasing now. We often get asked by clients, like in pitch situations, like, what's your stick rate? Like, how many of your placements are in the job after 2 years, 3 years, 5 years?
Right, exactly.
And that's become a real focus. I mean, we really view it. We have these guarantees in place where we'll redo a search if the person leaves in a certain amount of time or whatever. But we really view it as a big failure if the person doesn't work out. And if they don't work out, it's usually not just in the first year. It could, even if they don't work out in sort of the first 3 years, that something probably went wrong.
Yeah. Peggy, next question.
Yeah. You were talking about sort of the Citigroup level of CFO. Somebody wanted to know, is there a difference in qualifications and what you're looking for if it was at the $50 to $100 million business, or is it pretty much the same no matter what?
Yeah, no, I think it's different. I actually don't want to really make it seem like there's a set list of qualifications for anybody. I think it's very situational to the company. And in a company like Citigroup, the qualifications to be CFO of Citigroup are going to look really different than the qualifications for an $80 million private equity owned business, depending on what the business is. Doesn't mean that. I actually think the smaller company may actually be the harder job potentially, right? Because you may have less resources. It might depend on sort of what the company and the industry that it participates in. But we try to keep the qualifications very tailored to that situation. I do think that there's probably a certain resume that gets built over time to become CFO of Citigroup, whereas sometimes in smaller companies, because smaller companies change ownership a lot, you sometimes see people that gravitate, and they might work over the course of a decade. They might work for 3 different, sort of 75 to $150 million companies, and their qualification that might sort of keep them into more of that middle market framework going forward. Doesn't mean that they're better or worse candidates, but it does mean that the qualifications, they look a little different.
Okay, and I guess to piggyback on that, somebody else asked, if you could kind of say, what do you think specifically private equity firms are that are placing CFOs in their companies, what do you think they're looking for?
Yeah.
And let me just, before you get started, my impression has been they hire old people. They just want their work done.
Yeah, they are.
You gotta love them.
Private equity firms are typically really focused on pace and urgency and doing things quickly. They absolutely want that. That's a high tension role, right? Because the CFO has sort of one foot in the management team and one foot in the investor group. You know, the investor group wants them to represent the investor group, and the CEO wants them to feel like, no, you're part of this team. So it's a high tension role. I've done a lot of these searches. They can be great roles. They can be really rewarding. I do think that there are times when CFO candidates in private equity firms could do more due diligence about, and headhunters themselves could be more knowledgeable about the specifics of that situation at that company. I think finding out, why is there a need? Sometimes the answer in the private equity playbook is we're going to shoot the CFO, whereas there's really actually problems with the company, or there's problems with the deal, like the deal went off track. And the easiest answer from the investor point of view is, let's change the CFO, that'll fix things, that'll get the deal back on track. But there's actually other reasons why the deal went off track. So I prefer private equity situations. If I were a CFO candidate, I would look for it being a new deal, like a deal that was just struck, or following a leadership change, like there's a new CEO that went into an existing deal. Those are probably the most pristine situations that you would look at.
And understanding what the new CEO wants done.
That's right.
Right. All right. How can a CFO improve his or her board relationships? What are some, takeaways that you could give people?
Yeah, I think, so there's probably two quick parts to that. One is if you're in a company and you're wanting to improve the relationships with the board of the company you work with, I think just doing it the same way you'd build relationships with anyone, right? One-on-one, tailored, get to know the board members one-on-one, find out, ask them how they think you're doing, just the same way you would build rapport with anyone. Somebody told me early in my career, like whenever you're building relationships, think about three things. Think about communicate with people in a tailored way versus a mass way, if you can. That's coming under challenge a little bit during COVID with Zoom and everything. Always remember that life is long and relationships come back to you in ways you can't always foresee in the moment. And then third, always try to think what's in it for this person. So if you approach relationship building with board members from those three angles, and you just keep at it, hey, would it be okay if we set a quarterly call, or what's the right frequency to communicate with you? That's what I would say. If the question more pertains to how do I network more with board members to potentially get on board, so not in my own company, but I would start with people who well, who sit on boards, and get their advice. Obviously you need a one-page CV and all that kind of stuff, and I've got a whole booklet that I can send out that has to do with sort of getting on a board best practices, but start with people and network with people who sit on boards, and just be curious. Ask them, what do you like about being on a board? What are the challenges? What advice would you have about trying to be on a board? What are the things that were surprises to you when you first got on a board that you couldn't have foreseen? People can kind of glamorize the idea of being on a board. And when they get on it, it can be pretty challenging.
Jeff, golf.
Yeah, golf. Yeah, I mean,
just go out drinking, we have dinner. We don't have to do any real work. So let me ask you a question here about this whole board thing. Do you find most CFOs are a little naive about the politics?
I wouldn't say most, no. But I would say that that can be a challenge, right? Because CFOs tend to be very analytical. And many of them were kind of raised, came up in their careers in situations where there was, kind of a fairly definitive right answer. And as everybody knows in the boardroom, it's not always about the definitive right answer, right? There's nuance to everything, and there's judgments involved. So and sometimes what's the quote unquote wrong answer isn't necessarily dishonest or unethical. It's just a different interpretation of some of the data, right? So I think just trying to be understanding about that. Some of the case studies that you see in some of these assessments actually have to do with exactly that. Like, how would you navigate certain boardroom dynamics given new information that's, and I do notice, like, I've been involved in a lot of CFO assessments. Some CFOs tend to want to get to the black and white answer really quickly. Like, oh, well, with this new piece of information, I would call that out immediately in the board meeting, kind of meeting over. And it's like, well, really, would you? Like, that's not that practical, right? You're the CFO of the company. You're not actually going to call out the chairman in the moment and end the board meeting. Is there a different way to handle it? So, trying to be open-minded to some of the nuance of those situations, I think is pretty important.
Peggy, another question.
Yeah, they wanted to know if you have the skills that you need to be a CFO, but you're not yet a CFO. What do you recommend in trying to get your foot in the door to get to that next level?
Well, I think the odds are kind of with you, right? I mean, just looking at, not everybody's going to be a Fortune 500 CFO, but you look at the metrics in Fortune 500, right? 12% of Fortune 500 CFOs were lateral hires, meaning they were CFO of another Fortune 500 company. Only 28% were ever a public company CFO before that. So that means 72% of the Fortune 500 CFOs are first-time CFOs, first-time public company CFOs.
Oh, nice.
That trickles down too. I mean, it's maybe a little less the case in smaller to mid-cap companies. A lot of private equity firms say, find me the proven person. But I think, number one, you have to perform in the job you're in, right? And you have to kind of like communicate that you're performing. If you're what we call a step up, we love step up candidates. You need to get on the radar screen of the board somehow. And you need to get your mentors advocating for you. Everybody's got mentors, and get your mentors who are sitting CFOs introduce you to like the search people that place them in jobs. That's a great way to find access to it. I know a lot of like older CFOs at this point who are kind of professional board members who the first thing they will tell you, they will rattle off the dozen people in their careers that they're so proud kind of that they helped get to their first CFO job. So find those people and get those people to introduce you to the headhunters that kind of make the markets.
Peggy, next.
Basically, a lot of people were very interested in the packet you were talking about. So how would they go about getting that?
Yeah,
if you send it to me, I'll take care of distributing.
I'll get it to Matt. I'll get it out.
Registered for the call.
That's what
The other people are going to miss out.
Okay. I guess I have to go back to the chat thing now because.
Yeah, and there's also, I would say on that topic, I'll get it to Matt, but and this goes back to kind of like do your research. Most firms, and Korn Ferry I think included, I'm not totally steeped in the Korn Ferry's website yet, but I know like Spencer Stewart has a thought piece on its website about like tips for getting on a board. Most firms kind of have these pieces out there, and what I'll send to Matt will look pretty similar to like, you could probably find 4 or 5 versions of it on the big firm websites.
Yeah, but it's just a way of getting started for people.
Yeah, I guess there was another question that talked about, does industry experience take precedence over other leadership and collaboration skills?
It can. I mean, some industries in particular, I would say that's a big, going back to kind of where we started the conversation, as the CFO role has grown, you see collaboration and sort of leadership skills kind of trumping where the person comes from. So when you look at CFO transitions, which I'm a geek and I study these things all the time, you see people changing industries a lot now. So you look at, Ruth Porat going from Morgan Stanley to Alphabet, it's like a big example. But
I remember Lou Gerstner getting the IBM job, and he never even had a computer on his desk.
Yeah, that's right.
So there was something in his background that made that work.
Yeah, but there were some industries, like, for example, healthcare comes to mind, like healthcare services.
Mm-hmm.
You're not seeing a lot of like kind of large provider or payer systems that are bringing in CFOs from like a bank or something, right? Because there's a specialized kind of reimbursement revenue model that they really want somebody who sort of understands that kind of model. And pharma, you don't see a ton of like non-pharma talent coming into the big pharma companies in the finance ranks.
Yeah, sure. It's
Okay.
hard. It is hard to change industries, but some industries really need people from outside. I mean, you mentioned healthcare. Their model of giving discounts to the emergency room and making all their money off elective is not working out so well for them right now.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
I think
Anyway,
that's a
everybody,
longer model.
lots of,
Another question, Peggy?
no, lots of people were saying how much they appreciated this, how much they enjoyed it and thanked, and people were leaving. So
Yeah.
I
people-
think, you know, I
That's what
think
happens
we,
is when you reach your stop point, people start dropping off the call, and I try to be respectful of everybody's time. Is there another burning question?
nope.
Okay, so I just want to, Jeff, this has been a fabulous conversation. Just
Thank
fabulous. We covered so much ground. I want to thank you for your time, and yeah, you've presented you've presented the retained search business at the very least in a very positive light.
Well, thank
We now know you're not just evil people.
you. All right, mission accomplished.
Real
Thank you very
human
much for
beings.
having me.
And I just
Thank you
wanna
for, thank
so much
you.
for being on Chat with Matt.
Thank you.
So we're going to end the meeting for everybody. If you have questions that we didn't cover, you're welcome to write to me and I will forward them on to Jeff. And I can even write them up for the newsletter.
Thank you.
Jeff,
Thanks so much, Matt.
We recorded this meeting. I'll send you the link and we'll put it up on YouTube. You'll become famous.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Probably already famous, but you'll become more famous.
Thank you.
All right.
Again,
Bye-bye.
thank you
Stay
so much.
healthy. Happy holidays.
And
Thank
thank
you.
you everybody for joining us on Chat with Matt. Bye-bye.
Bye.